1066, the Battle of Hastings. That's coming up, but first, before you hear about how William conquered England, how about you get on the path to conquering your hair loss? Yes, this video is sponsored by our friends over at Keeps, who are reminding you that 2 out of every 3 men will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35. I know that! I'm not even 35 yet, and I haven't had hair for many years. I wish Keeps had been around when I was younger, because advances in science have meant that there are now treatments that can combat the symptoms of hair loss and help you keep the hair that you have. It's too late for me, my hair is not coming back. But you don't have to be like me. You can stop your hair loss early thanks to Keeps. Keeps offers generic versions of the only 2 FDA-approved drugs for treating hair loss. So, you may have tried them before, but never at a price this low. That's right, if you were thinking, some sort of medicine, Simon, is going to be mad expensive, well, you couldn't be more wrong. Keep starts at just $10 a month. How's it work? Well, one thing, there's no need to visit a doctor's office. Just schedule a quick online consult, and a little bit later a discreet package will arrive at your door, and you can use it in the privacy of your own home. So if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, that's one problem that you don't have to fix yourself. Do something about it. For a limited time, go to keeps.com/geographics or click the link in the description below to receive 50% off your first order. And now let's conquer some Anglo-Saxons. It seems like something out of a fantasy novel. 2 men lead their armies in battle, the result of which will decide who will be the king. This kind of romantic notion of warfare seems out of place today, but 1,000 years ago, this was exactly what happened along the south coast of England. In 1066 AD, a succession crisis triggered by the death of the king culminated in 2 powerful men and their armies meeting outside the town of Hastings. By the end of the day, the war was effectively over and the Kingdom of England would be changed forever. This is the incredible true story of kings, nobles, and royal intrigue that spilled over into war, in the process laying the foundation for England as we know it today. In the 5th century AD, as the Romans were evacuating Britain, the island was being invaded by 2 groups of Germanic-speaking peoples, barbarians known as the Angles and the Saxons. Over the following centuries, they alternatively fought with and intermarried both each other and the native Britons until they had divided the land up into what we today know as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxons found themselves under assault beginning in the 9th century by invaders from the Norse kingdoms, the Vikings. The Vikings conquered large tracts of northern England, but were eventually thrown out by Aethelstan, who had now united all of England under a single ruler. Almost 100 years later, the Vikings came back in force. The King of Denmark, Canute the Great, defeated the English king Aethelred and ruled England in personal union with Denmark and Norway until he died in 1035. His sons Harold Harefoot and Harthcanute were unpopular, and when the latter died suddenly in 1042, either of alcohol poisoning or as part of an assassination plot, depending on who you ask, the son of Aethelred, Edward, was crowned King of England, restoring the Anglo-Saxons to power. At the same time that the Vikings were invading England, they were also raiding along the coast of northern France. A century of conflict came to an end in 911 when the king of the Franks and a Viking leader named Rollo came to terms on a land settlement around the area where the Seine River empties into the English Channel, converting to Christianity in the process. This land evolved into the powerful Duchy of Normandy, in theory a vassal state of the King of France, but in reality an independent jurisdiction that wielded a lot of influence on their neighbours, especially in England. King Aethelred married Emma of Normandy, the sister of the Duke, in 1002, and their son Edward spent many years in exile in Normandy before becoming King of England. Illegitimacy was not an obstacle to inheriting the Duchy of Normandy, a holdover from Viking culture that placed less emphasis on legitimate land succession. This is how the bastard son of Duke Robert, William, became Duke of Normandy as a child in 1035. William survived years of warfare and assassination plots until, by 1060, his hold on Normandy was secure, and William began to look to new horizons. In In 1045, King Edward, known to posterity as Edward the Confessor because of his piety, he was later canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, married Edith of Wessex. Edith was the daughter of Godwin, who had been appointed Earl of Wessex by the Danish King Canute after his conquest of England. Godwin had subsequently become the most powerful noble in England, and so the marriage made sense politically. But the king personally hated Godwin, who had been responsible for the death of his brother years earlier, and this animosity finally boiled over in 1051 when the king accused Godwin of treason and the earl was forced into exile along with his sons. Edward sent Edith to a nunnery, probably hoping to divorce her and rid himself of the influence of the Godwins once and for all. But the Earl of Wessex wasn't going to go down without a fight. He returned to England the next year at the head of an army. Fearing a civil war, Edward was forced to reconcile with Godwin and restore Edith, but the marriage remained childless, and it became increasingly obvious throughout the 1050s that the king would die without a son to succeed him to the throne. The most obvious candidate to succeed Edward was Harold Godwinson, who had inherited the earldom of Wessex after his father's death in 1053. He was the king's brother-in-law and the head of a family that was now the most powerful in the country, with Harold and 3 of his brothers becoming earls, effectively controlling all of England subordinate to the king. But in the Middle Ages, the lack of a legitimate successor to a crown almost always led to war, and Harold's position was by no means secure. If he wanted to be King of England, he would have to fight for it. King Edward died on the 5th of January 1066, and Harold moved quickly. Being elected King of England by the Wittenegger Mote, an early Anglo-Saxon forerunner to Parliament, and being crowned by the Archbishop of York in Westminster Abbey the next day, he quickly consolidated his hold on the country, but as expected, faced rival claimants from outside of England. Of these, the most serious threat was considered to come from Duke William of Normandy. William claimed that King Edward promised William the throne of England in 1051 after the Godwins were exiled. He further claimed that Harold himself travelled to Normandy in 1064 and swore an oath to uphold William's claim upon the death of Edward. However, the only chroniclers who document these events occurring are Norman ones and can thus be accused of bias on William's behalf. Certainly, Edward knew the kings of England were elected by the Wittenegger Mote since he'd been elected himself, and thus him promising the kingdom to any individual would have no force behind it without the support of the nobles. As for Harold's trip to Normandy to swear fealty to William, this seems to be a gross exaggeration. Harold had been shipwrecked off the coast of Normandy and had been captured by the Count of Ponthieu, who turned him over to Duke William. It's likely that any oath sworn by Harold to William wasn't given willingly, and once he returned to England, Harold probably felt that he was under no obligation to abide by it. Regardless, William believed he had a right to the English throne and began raising an army to uphold his claim. Another claim was put forward by the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada. Harold's claim supposedly came from an agreement made between his predecessor, King Magnus, and King Harthacnut, who ruled both Denmark and England in 1038. The agreement stated that should either of them die without an heir, that the other should inherit his lands. This was a spurious claim at best, considering that Harold had been trying without success to conquer Denmark for years and had just renounced his claim to the throne when Edward died, but it was a claim that the Norwegian king was willing to pursue nevertheless. Harold Godwinson believed that the Normans were the more immediate threat, and he spent the summer of 1066 waiting with his army in the south of England for an invasion that didn't appear to be coming, although William was busy making preparations across the Channel. What Harold wasn't counting on was interference from his brother, Tostig. In the Middle Ages, kingdoms did not have standing armies. They were too expensive to maintain. When kings went to war, they either hired mercenaries or raised levies of peasants commanded by nobles. The problem with peasant levies is that they couldn't be mustered indefinitely. They needed to return to the farms for the fall harvest. This was the situation King Harold faced in September 1066. To him, it now seemed unlikely that William would be able to launch his invasion before winter made campaigning impossible, so he started sending his army home and was returning to London when he received word that Harald Hardrada had landed in northern England at the head of an army. What was worse, the Norse king was being assisted in this venture by Harold's own brother, Tostig Gudwinson. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria until he was deposed by his own subjects, and he blamed his brother for not helping him recover his land. Tostig decided his best chance at advancement was to ally himself with Harald Hardrada and invite him to depose his brother and take the throne for himself. Perhaps he believed that he would be able to rule England as regent when Harold returned return to Norway. In any case, a Viking army was now rampaging around the north of England, having defeated the local lords in battle. King Harold needed to act fast, and he headed north as fast as he could, gathering troops as he went. He made the almost 200-mile trip from London to Yorkshire in only 4 days, taking the Norwegians completely by surprise when the Royal Army appeared in front of them on September the 25th at Stamford Bridge. In the battle that followed, Tostig and Harald Hardrada were both killed, and the Norse army was destroyed, harried all the way back to their landing ships. There were so few survivors that only 24 of the 300 ships were needed to transport them back to Norway. It was a great and glorious victory, but it left Harold at a disadvantage. Much of his armies were now in the north of the country, battered and tired, needing time to recover. To make matters worse, on his way back to London, Harold learned that, finally, the Normans were coming. William had spent months assembling his invasion force. The primary holdup was his lack of a navy. He had to build that from scratch. In April, William watched as Halley's Comet appeared in the skies over Europe. He took this as a sign of favour from God. William's army was primarily made up of Normans, but also included contingents from Brittany and Flanders. His army probably numbered about 10,000, equally split between infantry, cavalry, and archers or crossbowmen. The infantry and cavalry wore chainmail that went down to their knees and had conical-shaped metal helmets with a nosepiece. The cavalry carried long lances, and both infantry and cavalry carried swords and rounded wooden shields reinforced with metal edges. The Normans landed at Pevensey on England's south coast on the 28th of September, only 3 days after Harold defeated the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge. It's likely William had no idea of the drama unfolding in the north of the country, but if he had, he would have likely considered it another sign of God's favour for his cause. After landing, William marched his army to Hastings, a seaside town that was the principal settlement in East Sussex, and built a wooden fortification there, intending to use it as a base of operations to raid the surrounding area. Though he was only about 50 miles south of London, William moved cautiously, trying to figure out where the English Royal Army was. He didn't want to be cut off from the sea, his principal base of supply. Harold had been forced to leave much of his army in the north of the country to mop up the Norwegian forces and to rest and recover after the battle. So the English king moved more slowly on his trip south, getting back to London in a week and spending another week in the city, gathering what forces he could. The English army was primarily composed of fyrds, or local levies commanded by a nobleman. The backbone of Harold's army were his housecarls, the forerunners of the knight-class royal retainers who were well armed and armoured. Unlike knights, however, housecarls fought on foot, using two-handed Danish great axes as their primary weapon alongside the infantry levies. The English army possessed almost no cavalry, and they also had far fewer archers than the Normans did. In the tradition of the Vikings, the English army, probably 10,000 strong, was almost entirely composed of infantry. Harold eventually left London and marched south to confront the Normans, encamping on Calbeck Hill on the night of October the 13th. The next day, October the 14th, both armies left their camps and met each other on a field 7 miles north of Hastings. The site today is home to a town named Battle. Harold positioned his army at the top of a steep slope. It was a prudent move since it protected his infantry army from the Norman cavalry. The English front rank formed a shield wall, interlocking their shields together to protect their troops in a rough imitation of a Greek phalanx. Against them, William organized his army into 3 battle groups, one under Alan the Red, one under William Fitzosborne, and one under the Duke himself. The battle groups were composed of infantry and archers, with the cavalry held in reserve. The battle began at around 9 a.m. with a volley from William's archers. This did little damage. The steep slope of the hill the English were on meant that the arrows either bounced off the shield wall or flew harmlessly over the heads of Harold's troops. To make matters worse, the Normans soon started running out of arrows. The traditional tactic of gathering up enemy arrows and reusing them was ineffective because the English had very few archers themselves. Seeing this wasn't working, William attacked with his infantry. They were met with a barrage of missiles, javelins, throwing axes, even rocks. Because the English were throwing downhill, these were more accurate and effective. Determined attacks by the Normans were unable to break through the English shield wall. At some point early in the battle, William's horse was killed and he fell to the ground. A rumour spread through the Norman ranks that the Duke had been killed, and panic gripped their soldiers. They began to flee the battlefield. Sensing victory was in sight, the English troops ignored their king's order to maintain their defensive positions and began to chase the fleeing Norman troops. But William was not dead. He acquired a new horse and rode through his ranks with his helmet off, showing his face to his troops and shouting that he was still in the fight. The Normans rallied and attacked the English troops who had pursued them, inflicting heavy casualties. At some point in the afternoon, there was a lull in the battle as both sides paused to catch their breath and lick their wounds. During the lull, William looked up the hill at the English shield wall, still unbroken despite the heavy fighting. He remembered the earlier confused fighting when the Normans began to rout and the English chased after them, breaking their discipline. The Duke realized that if he could replicate the action, fake a retreat, he might be able to get the English to chase his troops again, catching them in the open. This was the way the fighting progressed in the afternoon. The Normans attacked the English battle line, then retreated, a feigned rout. Each time they were able to coax some of the English to chase after them, only to get caught out and attacked by the resurging Normans. The fighting was vicious, hand-to-hand, swords, spears and axes inflicting gruesome injuries on soldiers. Casualties on both sides began to mount. William had at least one more horse killed from under him, perhaps two. The sun was getting low in the sky as the battle continued late in the afternoon. King Harold had to have been relatively pleased with his army's performance. Despite the chaos of the past month, dismissing his army, then recalling it, rushing north to fight a pitched battle against the Norwegians, and then rushing south to confront the Normans, despite not having cavalry and losing many of the housecarls in the full day's fighting, he had held his own against the more experienced Duke of Normandy. Soon, darkness would fall and the battle would have to be broken off. Harold would have the option of staying to continue the fight the next day or falling back to gather more reinforcements, a luxury he knew William would not have. But fate, it seems, was working against the English king, or as contemporary chroniclers put it, the hand of God intervened. Throughout the day, the Norman archers continued to fire at the English, despite it being apparent that it was doing little damage because of the terrain and the defensive positioning of the English army. Completely by chance, one of these arrows seemed to appear out of nowhere, striking Harold in the eye, the shaft penetrating the eye socket and passing into his brain. The king fell from his horse, killed instantly. The death of the king proved decisive. Once word spread through the ranks that had fallen, the English army began to fall apart. The levies that had stood firm the day before now broke and ran for their lives as the Normans pressed another attack home. The shield wall now collapsed and a general rout began. Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, rallied some troops around the king's body, but they were overwhelmed and killed as well. As darkness descended, the battlefield belonged to the Normans. William was victorious. Although William faced some scattered resistance to his conquest over the next 2 months, the war was effectively over. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. With all other claimants now dead, he was the only one left standing, with the prize clutched in his fist. The Norman conquest would completely transform English society over the 2 decades that William the Conqueror, as he was now styled, and his heirs ruled England. The conquest marked a turning point. Up until Hastings, English culture was more closely aligned with Scandinavia, a product of generations of Viking raids and conquests, as well as the similarity between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons in the first place. From now on, English society began to mirror that of the European continent, particularly France. For hundreds of years, French was the spoken language in the English court. Official documents were printed in French and Latin instead of Old English, and the kings of England spent as much time out of England in their continental possessions as they did within it. Norman barons intermarried with Anglo-Saxon nobility, creating a new, distinctly English aristocracy. William invested heavily in the infrastructure of his new realm. He built many new castles to house his newly created nobles and protect the land from incursion by the Welsh or the Scots. The most famous of these is the Tower of London, which today houses the crown jewels. William died in 1087, but his royal bloodline can be traced through the centuries to his 22nd great-granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II. The Battle of Hastings was itself commemorated through an extraordinary piece of historical record. Not long after the battle, William's half-brother, Bishop Odo, commissioned a tapestry to commemorate the events of the Succession Wars, ending with the Battle of Hastings. The tapestry stretches a remarkable 70 meters long and has survived relatively intact over 900 years, avoiding the destruction of both the French Reign of Terror and the occupation by the Nazis. It is today displayed in its own museum in Bayeux, in Normandy. Almost 1,000 years later, we can look back on the Battle of Hastings as a decisive turning point in English and UK history. Before the battle, England was seen as essentially a backwater of Europe, subject to conquest by the Romans, Saxons, and Vikings. After the Norman conquest, England began to be forged into a strong independent kingdom with a unique national identity, one that eventually grew to become one of the most powerful nations in Europe. Once it had merged with Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, the United Kingdom became an empire that at one point was the most influential in the entire world. It can be truly said that the birth of the modern English state took place on a hill not far from the town of Hastings, where 2 men and their armies met to decide who had the right to rule, and in the process, changed the course of history. So I really do hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do use that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, check out today's fantastic sponsor, Keeps, linking to them below. And thank you for watching.